Hey everyone, I have no idea what time it is or like how many sessions are left after this.
It's 4:50. We have what, 40 minutes? I don't know. I can't. I
Okay.
can't get on the internet.
Well, let's say that we have until 5:30, and it is 4:50 now. So this is the user interface session. So if you're not interested in user interface, then
You're in the wrong session.
you're in the wrong session. So basically, the way I'm hoping to run this is that basically one of the points on our roadmap that Paul and Burke talked about the other day is that improving the user interface, or user interface. We actually phrased it when we were talking about the roadmap as awesome user interface. Everyone agrees that we need an awesome user interface. Not necessarily everyone agrees on exactly what that is. So what I'd kind of like to do is get more from people what direction what direction you guys think we should go. I myself, like for me, sort of the thing that my take would be that what we need to do is redo large parts of the patient level web application, so sort of improve flow of a lot of pages and improve doing a lot of usability improvements just to make sure that things work the way they look like they should work, making things not necessarily always follow the user interface screen does not have to look like the data model but on paper or but on a screen. So my inclination is that that's the sort of change we need to make. What I'm hearing from our PIH Rwanda project, and this is also going to be coming more broadly from, I think, the Rwandan government, although we just haven't heard that from them yet, but that at least is that our HIV patient record needs to be not just, it shouldn't actually be an encounter form based thing, but it should actually be able to represent something that looks more like a patient chart. Something that looks like it has actual pages, and there's a page about demographic information and a page about lab results and a page about regimen and a page about weights. So that's sort of that's what I'm hearing from our Rwanda project. From Chris Seerecht's, I'm hearing that what we actually need is we actually kind of need a more feature-rich EMR experience that sort of that looks more like an EMR that, in the sense of having not just sort of data collection about patients, but also more beyond that. I mean, visit scheduling and a whole bunch of other stuff. So at the same time, what you hear from Malawi is actually it should just be a touchscreen, and it should run like da-da-da-da-da. So there's a lot of different viewpoints out there. The other thing coming from programmers is that the framework we're using does not make it as easy to do good UI as it should, and that's sort of definitely one that we have been discussing off and on, but I don't think I don't think that's what this session should be about. We have some ideas, but please, let's talk about that later if you're interested. So, user interface. Who here has an opinion about what it should mean to make the OpenMRS user interface better?
Well, I have a lot of opinions, but I'll try to limit it. One is I think we want to match workflows what people need. From a use case perspective, I want something ideally that is aesthetically pleasing, that people look at and they like the way it looks. In this era of CSS and all the Web 2.0 glitz and glamour, there's a lot of examples of that, and so I'd like to pull in someone with that good kind of eye for making a nice looking site. Now, obviously, that is not important in terms of get anybody necessarily getting their job done, but it does have an impact in terms of how people feel about the system.
I think it is important, actually, in that.
Yeah. It's not as important
Flow
as
is
something that works.
Like
Flow
tone
is important. And I think there's a lot of conventions that we could follow that we don't always follow in terms of, to me, a good user interface, there's a predictableness to it. And so one of the things we get into, especially as people, different people are making different pages, is that we don't always follow the same conventions, and there's not always the little details of well, the column should be sortable, or this little icon should be at the end, not at the beginning of the row, and things that change from one place to another. So there's a lot of little detail like that that could be managed. As a developer and as an architect, what I really want to see is us to get a framework that can have data-driven form development, so that maybe with a week or so of Daniel's time, we could have him make a framework for us that lets us bypass every other framework that exists, and then just kind of drag and drop everything on the screen.
I hadn't thought of that.
So is this talking towards the idea of templating for OpenMRS?
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate dream was, I grew up on a system, and some people have already heard this, but the guy who I worked for, Clem McDonald, is one of the leaders of the informatics field, and is just a genius when it comes to pretty much life. But he sat down to create an order entry system, and what he created was a program that would render, given data, could render a form. So his first program was a form renderer, and then he hand created a definition of a form that lets you define forms. So his first step was, he bootstrapped his way in to say, now I have a definition of a form that lays out all the fields, collecting all the information I need to define my next form. And from that point on, every form that was built in the system, whether it was collecting data from users, an order session, people ordering medications, or if it was a system, an administrative tool to manage certain aspects of the system, all use that same forms engine. So there was this predictability, and it was also the fact that you didn't have to program anything to go and build a new form. You just say, I want these fields, and this, and it was simple in terms of the layout. It was done in DOS, so it's nothing that we're gonna adopt. But that concept, that paradigm, I would love to see us work toward. I think it's going to be an evolution, but I would hope we get our forms more and more powerful to the point that we look around and say, well, why do we need something else? We can just use this for almost every aspect of the application. But
so
that's the blue sky, way out there.
I'll go behind you a couple for so one of our mentors as far as UI goes, Paul English, who's sort of was the founder of kayak.com, which you should all book all of your flights on. Not that that's an endorsement, but it's an endorsement. We've discussed user interface with him a bunch of times, and one of the things he most says is, look, you guys need a style guide, and that's the way you're going to have a consistent and good interface. And so I've sort of promised him that we will do that. Otherwise, he probably won't talk to us again.
Can we steal someone's, or steal a couple of them and turn that into our style guide?
I think we can do that. We can steal someone else's style guide to some extent, but
Most
I think
of the thing we've done.
Darius, do you mind defining style guide for us?
Sure.
I just think most of the things we've done well, we've done by stealing from other people.
Please, let me speak.
That and having Daniel program.
I just want to share this because usability is my passion, but it's not very popular. With the tool that Daniel developed, I know it may be a joke, but definitely it will facilitate the pathway to get a good user interface with a lot of humble and love I'm sharing with you. Then I developed a standard for clinical system for user interface, having in mind an electronic record. It took 4 years to develop because it went through a lot of consultation. Therefore, there are some point of reference of how an electronic medical record should look like. I insist we must not refer as form only, because a form limited the power of OpenMRS, really.
So a style guide is, what I envision our style guide being is, so there's, as you say, there's a lot of work out there that has already been done that we should steal. about how to do user interfaces right. You know, it took 4 years to do, but we can steal it in 5 minutes. Here, look over there. But not every developer, we need to make it easy for every developer who comes and wants to contribute something to OpenMRS. They don't need to go read a long technical document describing everything. They want to go see a short summary of, you know, this is what we want things to look like, and in fact, these are code snippets that in order to do this effect, just, you know, here's an example code snippet. That's what I envision our style guide looking like. It's sort of a combination of like the way we want things to look, as well as pointers on how to do it.
I think another aspect to ease of use could be that you have kind of a task-oriented do that if you are interested in creating an if you're interested in creating an X form, as an example, there's an indicator that, okay, do that, then do this, then do this, then do this, along the process almost. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to express, but
We don't have wizards anywhere.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's the word, wizards, for different tasks that you want to accomplish. Because it isn't always intuitive.
The other thing that Paul English made me promise to do for him is write sort of a list of all of our roles and tasks they need to carry out, and sort of a cross-tab of those versus each other. So, yeah, we don't do nearly enough sort of task-oriented wizards or anything like that.
And so along that line, I think we might need two separate style guides. I mean, we might need one that deals with, when we're displaying information for physicians or other users, how are we going to display it? But the other one, I think, has to do with builders, because one of the big goals is to have this thing configurable and usable by non-developers, okay? And along that line, I think that we should use mapping a lot more. So like have a table of, you know, at the top, this element is created by so-and-so. And then down in the actual place where you're doing your building, you would use the element name and not have to carry that along. I think that something consistent like the schema designer, where you use like an outline with drag and drop or move and slide or select and insert, you know, I was feeling that all the time during your report generation stuff, is that it needed some sort of graphical organization to help you express the logic that you were trying to express. So that's one, and I guess the second one is more like process-oriented, which is that I think maybe we could try and do something. It's not really pair programming, but if when someone wants to contribute something, that if we have a list of people who could, you know, be assigned as like reviewers to see what they were doing and checking against the style guide and getting usability issues addressed, you know, before the code got submitted, you know, someone who had worked with OpenMRS and knew the way various things were done and said, okay, this is sort of like that. To be consistent with that, you should use this method of doing it
well, I
instead
think
of...
we have
exactly
code
right.
review,
Like
we need UI review.
I mean, you can't expect people to build things that look a consistent way if you've never told them that this is what that consistent way is.
Yeah.
And so we need to make that convention.
It's perfectly analogous to code review.
And as Burke says, it's perfectly analogous to code review. If code is reviewed, so should user interface be.
I have two quick comments. First, has there ever been anyone associated with OpenMRS who considers themselves first a designer and second a developer or a clinician or an implementer or that kind of thing?
What if it's first at everything?
Justin's pointing at himself, but no. No, so we have, I mean, there's, we actually have a bunch of mock-ups of UI mock-ups for a new user interface that were done by a guy, Bob Shung, who was PIH's data manager in Lesotho for a year, but he was actually a graphic designer sort of in a previous life. So, but that's the closest that we have, but no, the answer really is no.
Yeah, we don't have a Jeff Raskin.
It would be
I think
great
you
to
knew the
attract
answer
those
to that,
people.
right?
Yes. What?
I think you knew the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of did, and so my follow-up point was basically like, we need to find a way to make this project attractive to those people. So it's not like we hire a consulting group to pay a bunch of money and have them make a mock-up that our developers implement. Like, let's find a way, because there are a lot of developers who designers who like to use their skills for causes. I know a few. And I think we need to start reaching out to those people so that they're like regulars, sort of, I would say. My other comment is that I grew up on WordPress, sort of. And when you get to a point where there's not one monolithic UI and, people don't have to feel like they're in control or they're like the boss and changing everybody's UI, it's like seen as acceptable and the thing you do to kind of have your own. You see a lot different kind of innovation and collaboration and developing new ideas and sharing them, and then kind of best ideas rising to the top.
So I think that's actually a good point, and one of the issues that we need to do better is the role-based UI, so that you log in for a particular function or you use the system for a particular function, and then you get a much more limited view on the system and on the data. We did a lot of that with NVRTB, the idea, and same with OpenMRS Express, trying to hide functionality so that you had a much clearer path and just putting the key information in one place. But I think that's one of the things you see with the current user interface. We still have the concept dictionary on the top of virtually every screen, and clearly that's not something that the majority of our users need.
Mm.
Is there no way we can look at taking what I believe is the UI has been very closely infused with the current data and the concept dictionary and abstracting that out, and coming from a Joomla side of things where you're using templates and what they're called module positions and components within it to effectively build a web application, where OpenMRS starts to look at actually really abstracting the functionality and the visualization to the point of calling particular components in areas of the site, and be able to load a template which you can then load your data into and apply a skin or a theme on top of.
So I think that's sort of along the lines of what Burke means by having a data, it's similar to what Burke means by having a data-driven UI. I've also been thinking about, and haven't figured out exactly how to do this, but having done work on HTML form entry now, and X forms should be, I think, similar, you ought to be able to embed an HTML form, an X form, in the user interface somewhere and have it just work. And so, like Carola said, it's not all forms.
An exact, will you put it up? Or? I insist, if you want to be serious about usability, you must use the right technique for usability. What we're talking about, I feel then it's developers thinking of graphical representation in a user interface. But I insist, if you want to really use usability principles, as you identified, as long as you get the user profile right, you can predict that flow. And if you identify the right task, as Julia identified, you can really come up with this style guide very easily because it's based on the task. Then it comes behind the information model and the data-driven. Because I think if we're serious about having a usable and a strong data representation within your user interface, it's very proven that the human factors are more important than the data-driven task.
So I feel like I agree with that.
Thank you.
I think that we've, to some extent, so we don't have a designer who loves us and wants to, be our designer. But partly, we're in a position where actually, so if we had that designer who loves us and comes through and says, all right, this is actually, things should work more like this, we're not agile enough to be able to make that change. And as a result, they would, I think, rapidly become bored and go off to something where like their designs will actually get implemented sooner. So I think, while I agree that it's not about the technical side of things at all, and I think the one thing that's going to have the one thing that would have the most impact is if we actually did usability tests and then fixed things after them. That would be like hugely valuable. But I think, given where the system is now and the UI is now, we don't have a core set of UI functions that people who are developing things can easily use. Regardless of what those look like, we don't have a place for them. And at the same time, we don't have a mechanism that makes it really easy to go and start redoing parts of the interface or have an alternate user interface. Like it feels like, okay, if we're gonna fix things, or if we're gonna change things and redo things, we kind of have to do it all, and all is a lot. So getting to a point where we can actually put some common functions in one, and designs and styles in one place, and let people start building that out piece by piece.
Yeah, I think Darius, you make a good point, and that is that we can come out with great style guide and great ideas of how to style, but if we're building that into a system where we're not real happy and not very agile with how we're laying things out, we're headed for trouble, because you can't be responsive, exactly like you're saying. So I think step one is probably in parallel. I guess step 1 and 2 in parallel would be working on the style guide and getting, trying to entice some style conscious people to join and be essentially, yeah, well, I'm not going to comment. I think it very much models what we do with code review. We didn't have code review when we started, and we didn't really have a lot of conventions, and so people coded what they coded. We started getting conventions, and people, started doing those a little bit, but then once we piled on that code review, where people would look at your code and say, hey, you need to follow this convention, this convention, this convention, we've, I think, made a real leap forward in terms of just how the code is managed. And we can do the same thing with UI, but I think that as we start to build up those conventions by pulling that guide together and getting the people that can help do the reviewing, we could at the same time look and try to find that framework, or define, it's switching to jQuery, and it's finding whatever tooling or framework, partly, using portlets or these plugin modules like Carl was talking about. Although I'm not necessarily sold on like that is the ultimate solution for doing everything, because I don't, you can end up with the quilt pattern kind of look of your, where you may get these little portlets kind of right, but you don't
now
get
how?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't.
It could look like a quilt again.
I think being able to plug things in is powerful, but it doesn't necessarily replace the overall, addressing the UI. So getting the framework in parallel while we, getting that sorted out in parallel while we work on the style design and getting the resources to get review happening. Because just like we've done with code review, we could have, as people create new stuff, that not only does it go under code review, it goes under UI review, and you get these comments of what you need to do with your code, as well as these comments of what your user interface needs to change. And then, just like we've done with code review, we could kind of pick our battles on what's most important, going retrospectively and saying, oh, here's features that we need to rebuild this part of it first, and go through that same process.
I semi-agree, although I actually think that if someone spends an hour redoing UI to do with like a new thing they contributed, instead of spending an hour doing improved UI on the patient dashboard, that's actually probably a mistake or a misallocation of priorities. I don't know if the same person would have done it. So I don't think it's the same model as code review where we can say, okay, from now on, all the new stuff must be like so, and the old stuff, you know, since we know it's working more or less, we'll get to it as we have time. I think
I don't quite
UI.
follow you. Say, you mean you want some of the new stuff to look ugly?
No, I'm saying that UI is sort of
Can't
a
leave
whole.
the old stuff just
You don't
as is.
see the old code in the same way that you see the old UI. Like if all the new pieces look pretty and the old pieces are ugly.
I think that's more
Just as a
incentive to fix the old
simplification.
pieces. But I don't think, I guess I
Sure.
disagree that you sacrifice and make some crappy new stuff so that you can focus some energy on the old stuff. I think
That's yeah. I don't think we need to argue that point. The other piece that I think will be important is being more agile with the application side of things. And I mean, this is sort of my goal when we have the resources to make it happen, is to decouple sort of the API and the API's release process from the UI, from like the sort of web application and its release process. Anyway, so I think that sort of as it is, like, I mean, it's taken, well, when do we release 1.4 to releasing 1.5? Now, that is admittedly a lot longer than we want it to be. At the same time, if it takes that long to get in a quick little UI improvement, then, you know, we're not in good shape.
Okay, I understand your position in short term is a style. Therefore, we won't call it a usability testing then, not quite yet. However, in the long term, as a perspective of a medical record system itself, when you really talk about a user interface that is usable, eventually have to follow the cognitive process of the decision maker. If I insist that even though you don't have the resources to do it now, I encourage that as a community, you flag to the new developers that usability testing is essential for the success of the user interface. If you're just declaring that, then make them think or put them part of the resources when you implement OpenMRS.
I completely agree with that. I'm just saying that we're missing the mechanism by which we can communicate that to people, almost.
Yeah.
So, okay. Right.
Sorry. Do you have any suggestions, Carola, about somebody you might like to do some usability testing on the existing system?
Thank
I
you
know
for
it'll be a
saying
big, broad picture.
No, I'm thinking of proposing Melbourne University someone who actually does proper usability testing, and I think it's a matured enough system to go through that, because it's an ugly thing. You actually go to a psychiatrist and they tell you how you look mentally. Usability testing will do that to the user interface, and it is painful exercise, because you're totally correct, Darius. It means changing things, but it's you in charge of prioritizing that. They have shown though that usability testing and electronic health record save errors in decision, and is important to me that OpenMRS takes seriously.
No, and that was what my snide comment to Burke about the
Coding.
it looking pretty is actually like it actually can improve as implementers at sort of a abstract level, I guess. It's not just, so I can think of a million problems with the user interface as is, but are there people who like want, not just there are particular problems with it, but it doesn't actually, it's not the kind of user interface you're looking for. It's not sort of you're looking for you're not looking for something that's based around a patient dashboard. You're looking for something else. Is there anyone out here who has sort of a radically different take on? Is there anyone who thinks that if we just went and sort of redid the user interface to be more consistent and flow a little bit better, and have more, better, prettier colors, that would actually be a mistake. What we actually should do is something else. Does anyone feel that way? I know that Cheryl has her. I know you aren't listening. That's why I called on you. No. So, for example, in Rwanda, we want this sort of chart view of things.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that at all, quickly or
What do you
briefly?
mean to the forms?
Yeah, as in not so much the forms, but
Being able to view the maps.
so I said that.
What do you want me to say?
No, well, so what I said was, our Rwanda project is complaining that they don't really want to follow this, like, find a patient, enter a form. It's not like a encounter form-based view of things. It should actually be more of a patient chart-based view.
Okay, you're not having every single piece enters a separate encounter.
Right.
Okay. I think I know what you're getting at, but let me check. So I think as our process is expanding, we're looking at using things like summary charts plus encounter forms, and on top of that, having patients registered at the counter. That we're going to end up with many encounters that don't actually represent visits, that actually represent pieces of data, and that's actually not necessarily going to be useful to the person who's looking at that, but may be useful to someone at a different point. So we might need some sort of hierarchy in that actually makes sense, because I think our clinicians like looking at the encounter list because it gives a quick look at how often they've seen a person. And once we start having little pieces of data as a separate line, it's no longer going to be able to do that for them. Is that what you meant?
No, but that's also useful.
Okay.
One thing I noticed about some of the EMR, web-based EMR systems at least, such as the LMR, or Longitudinal Medical Record System at the Brigham, is that there's an incredible amount of stuff on the screen. There's like boxes and lines and sections and so on. And personally, I find that quite confusing. And I think particularly people who are new users, it's really about learning how to fly, a 747 rather than getting some key information. So I don't know that the paradigms of all of the existing EMR systems are necessarily the best ones. So I'm sure that there are elements that are good for that.
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. The hierarchy of critical data elements that have to appear, for example, allergies or critical information for the user. That's exactly correct, Hamish. At the moment, a current system don't have a good user interface, and they're causing trouble. And what Cheryl was describing is how to separate what is important to this user profile and what is important to the others. And from a patient's point of view, is to save the people's life. And usually the critical data should be in the right corner because evidence shows that is the position it should be. And it should be red color rather than blue, because that's the color we relate with the paper world. This is this critical elements, then it have to be there as a basic usability elements.
Yeah, I actually used to think that I said I was this. My girlfriend is a doctor, and
Yes.
I used to think that our user interface sort of was limited until I looked at their medical record system. Like, man, that's terrible. So I'm feeling better about the UI than I was sort of before that.
I would just reiterate what both of them said from a different perspective. Working in Malawi and working with Baobab a lot, what they've done is actually really simplify things. And they can do that a lot more than general OpenMRS can, because they're working with very specific treatment protocols basically mandated by the Ministry of Health in Malawi. And it's really like a wizard interface. Pretty much all you see on a screen at one time is one question, and it's often yes or no, or drop box, or fill in this one value. And so, yeah, I just wanted to comment that it takes like no time at all to turn, the janitorial staff into data entry clerks with that system.
And I actually don't think that it's one or the other. I mean, there's no reason that we couldn't have sort of wizard-like threads, threads.
Or task-oriented.
Task-oriented things for specific roles that are just totally guided. It happens that some users see those, or like some users when they log in, they've got a page with like 5 tasks. They click one, and they get a very prescribed wizard. I think, that would be a great thing to have, and it would be much easier if we had just a little bit of framework that doesn't make every programmer who wants to do something like that have to do it all from scratch.
Yeah.
Yeah, part of what I wanted to comment on is just that Baobab can do that because they're working with a unique single treatment protocol. And if it became feasible for individual implementations to do that a little bit, like with some kind of templating thing where they can make UI changes without, rewriting modules.
Without
basically.
programming per se.
Or, doing like basic HTML and CSS and maybe a little bit of hacking, whatever, but not really like programming.
Right, so I have a vision that's sort of percolating around about using HTML form entry as well as some other pieces in a way that lets you you should be able to define a wizard with some skip logic and a wizard with some skip logic, but that includes, as each page, it could be an HTML form, it could be an X form, it could be a regular page from the UI, that sort of thing. Like you could have a short HTML form, which again doesn't, you can do it without needing to compile any modules. It has a couple questions about something or other, and one of the questions is, did they start a regimen? If you check that, then they get redirected to some next step about updating the regimen, and so on. I think I'm hoping to get a chance to try to start to build some of that framework, play around with it.
But
I think we need as a group to get someone, on discovering framework. I know we've already done some diligence in terms of looking at frameworks, and there's not a lot of ones that just blow you out of the water, and that's why I was only half kidding when I talked about Daniel creating one for us. But but what we did when we looked at Spring is, we looked at a couple alternatives. We did a few things in it and said, okay, using, based on what is most popular, which is, there's lots of good reasons to go with something that's popular because one, it's probably one of the best ones, but almost or easily as importantly is there's going to be support for, when everybody finds the next most popular thing, transitioning from one to the other. So, but getting some due diligence to find that framework, and we need to do that as a team to move this forward.
Yeah, the actual, our requirements in a new user interface framework are actually quite difficult in that we want something that makes it quick and easy to write code for an advanced programmer, but at the same time, there's a lot of frameworks that have really cool features. If you've been programming Java for 15 years, you're like, yeah, this is amazing, but don't make it easy for someone to step up and just write their first page without spending months learning the framework. And there are things that are really easy, but don't necessarily have the higher level or
we want the one that the experienced developer looks at and says, this makes it easy to make something, and it's flexible as can be, and then we use that to develop the one that the person who isn't the heavy duty developer can come to and say, oh, okay, I click this, and this, and I've got it. How's that sound?
That's a way. Some days I agree with that. Some days I don't.
which day is it?
I'm not going to answer that. Can someone get Justin a microphone? So we actually looked. Mike and I spent a bit of time looking at. We never really looked at Tapestry. We looked at the videos about Tapestry, and they look really cool, but we're not sure how well supported that's going to be. We looked at GWT, and my take on that was that it wasn't going to play so well with our API, but I feel like that's worth a revisit. With a Wicket, Mike likes Wicket a lot. It seems really cool. I'm afraid it's not going to be well supported enough. But you're right, there's really nothing like there's nothing out there that when you see, this is exactly what we want. I mean, JSF is another thing that we should really be looking at.
I think the one feature that I'm looking for, and Mike and I just had this conversation this morning, was when I change a Java class, it deploys automatically. And the application updates. But the application updates automatically. It's kind of like PHP. You make a change and it's there. And that,
Rapid development.
Yeah, exactly.
Something that really supports rapid development and rapid code, I think.
One thing I'd like to see, and we touched on this a little bit, but is the ability to sort of allow modules to be sort of content providers and not necessarily to have modules sort of predefine where they're going to put everything that they produce in the system, so that, if we could have a framework, because OpenMRS, we run into this a lot with the reporting framework too, because we're trying to produce something that's very general and able to be used in a lot of different implementations to meet specific needs, and to have sort of a UI framework which provides a bunch of different sort of pieces of content that can be included in a predefined way, in a way that works really well, but which different modules could also produce content. And then when a system is configured, out of the box it may come in a pre-configured way, but which makes it easy for an implementer to sort of change what content is available on what page or in what order, or that kind of thing, without having to write a lot of code. So you could install modules that provided content, but you could then, through configuration, sort of like a portal framework, but not one in which that you necessarily give all the users the ability to move everything around, but which a given implementation can configure to be laid out in the way that they want to.
So I assume we're drawing near time.
2 minutes over.
Okay, 2 minutes over is not bad. So what I guess what I'd like to ask is, going forwards, who out here is willing, able or not, willing or not, I guess, able or willing or both, to contribute to sort of helping, to improving the user interface? And that can really be at any level. That can be as a developer, as a tester, as a wise sage or as someone who will just go find us developers and testers, or a designer. So I'm not going to write your names down now, but let's.
There's a page on the wiki, right?
Is there a page on the wiki?
We make one.
Someone taking. Oh, there is a page on the wiki from 2 years ago here when we talked about UI. At the time.
Is that old?
At the time we I feel like we're closer now to being able to actually devote the resources to do something, as opposed to still scrambling to finish things that had to come first. So anyway, there is probably a user interface working group on the wiki. We could repurpose that perhaps, but actually, are there notes about this? Are there notes about this session? I forgot to check for a note taker. Probably not. All right. Well, we'll create a blank page. I'll write down what's there, and we can all sign up. Well, anyone who wants.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.